A boy's courage. When the unthinkable happened. The sun dipped low over the riverbank in Sacramento, California, casting a golden glow on the calm waters below. It was one of those evenings where the world felt peaceful, too peaceful to ever be disrupted. On the old stone bridge, a spot locals often visited for quiet reflection, two figures stood silhouetted against the horizon. Elliott Harmon, a man in his 70s, leaned against the railing. His tailored jacket and polished shoes hinted at wealth, but his slightly hunched posture betrayed his age. Elliott was known as a generous donor to the community, funding schools and shelters. Yet behind the polished image, whispers followed him, stories of arrogance, a sharp tongue, and a habit of reminding people of the favors he'd done for them. Beside him stood Lorraine, a woman in her early 40s with auburn hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. She was one of Elliott's trusted confidants, or so he thought. Her polite smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she nodded along to his words. To a casual observer, they might have seemed like old friends catching up. But tension simmered beneath the surface. "You don't think I know what's been going on, Lorraine?" Elliott's voice grew sharper, his hands gesturing emphatically. "You can't keep these things hidden forever." Lorraine's grip tightened on the strap of her handbag. She tilted her head slightly, her tone dripping with forced patience. "You've always been so paranoid, Elliott. Maybe it's the age catching up to you." The river below flowed quietly, indifferent to the brewing storm above. Birds chirped in the distance, the last sounds of daylight, as if nature itself hadn't noticed the growing unease on the bridge. What the two didn't realize was that someone else was nearby, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Hidden by the tall reeds along the bank, a 9-year-old boy named Theo sat on a rock, tossing pebbles into the water. He often came here after school, letting his imagination run wild in this secret little world of his. But today, his eyes drifted up toward the figures on the bridge. Something about the way they stood, the way their voices rose and fell, made his stomach tighten. Lorraine's polite smile finally faded, replaced by a look of steely resolve. Elliott didn't notice the shift, too absorbed in making his point. "You think I won't do anything about it? I've dealt with people like you before." Theo couldn't hear every word, but the tone said enough. He tucked himself further behind the reeds, his heart pounding in his chest. The stillness of the evening was about to break. Elliott stepped closer to Lorraine, his voice lowering but losing none of its bite. "You've used me, haven't you? All the trust, the opportunities I gave you, it's all been a game to you." Lorraine's grip on her handbag tightened, her knuckles whitening. "You don't understand," she said, her voice suddenly cold and detached. "You think your money makes you invincible, that it gives you the right to control people, but you're just an old man who can't see what's right in front of him." Elliott narrowed his eyes, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "And what's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced over the edge of the bridge, her expression hardening. Elliott's voice softened slightly, perhaps sensing a shift he couldn't quite place. "Lorraine, whatever you think you're doing—" But he didn't finish the sentence. In a movement so swift it caught even herself by surprise, Lorraine lunged forward and shoved him with both hands. Elliott's cry of shock was brief as his body tipped over the railing and disappeared into the cold, rushing water below. The sound of the impact was muffled, swallowed by the river's current. Lorraine froze, her hands still outstretched, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd done. The echoes of her heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the water. She didn't see Elliott resurface. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, panic threatening to consume her. But then, her eyes flicked to the empty pathway behind her. There was no one. No one had seen. She smoothed the front of her coat, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the strap of her handbag. Taking a shaky breath, she turned and walked away, heels clicking against the stone bridge as if nothing had happened. But Lorraine had miscalculated. Down by the riverbank, hidden behind the reeds, Theo watched it all. His breath caught in his throat, and he clamped a hand over his mouth to keep from gasping aloud. His mind raced, struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Elliott's body reappeared briefly in the water, his arms flailing weakly against the current. He wasn't moving toward the shore. He wasn't moving at all. Theo's first instinct was to run. He was just a kid. This wasn't his problem. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the thought of his own grandfather, who had taught him to fish on this very river. Maybe it was the faint, desperate sound of Elliott's struggles. Whatever it was, Theo knew he couldn't just walk away. He had to do something. Theo's heart raced as he stepped out from behind the reeds. He glanced toward the bridge, half expecting to see the woman staring down at him, but she was gone. The path was clear, except for Elliott struggling in the water below. The boy's small hands trembled as he scanned the area. No one else was around. "Hey!" Theo shouted, his voice cracking with fear and urgency. "Hey, can you hear me?" Elliott barely turned his head, his energy fading as the current pulled him further from the bridge. Theo's chest tightened. The man wasn't going to make it on his own. He kicked off his sneakers and waded into the river, the icy water biting at his legs. It was colder than he'd imagined, and his breath hitched with every step. "Hold on!" he yelled, trying to keep his voice steady. But the river wasn't waiting for him. Elliott's head slipped under the surface, and panic surged through Theo's veins. He stumbled back onto the bank, scanning wildly for something, anything, that could help. His eyes landed on a thick branch wedged against a boulder a few feet away. Scrambling toward it, he grunted as he yanked it free. The wood was heavier than he expected, but it was strong, sturdy. He dragged it to the water's edge, his feet sinking into the muddy bank. "Grab this!" he shouted, shoving the branch as far into the river as he could. Elliott's hand broke the surface, weakly grasping at the air. Theo stepped further into the river, the current pushing hard against his small frame. The cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't stop. "Come on!" he yelled, his voice echoing against the quiet surroundings. Finally, Elliott's fingers found the branch. For a moment, they slipped, unable to grip, and Theo's stomach dropped. "No, no, don't let go!" he cried, summoning all his strength. Elliott latched on, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Theo dug his heels into the muddy ground and pulled. The current fought back, pulling both of them deeper into the river, but the boy refused to let go. His arms burned, his legs shook, but he gritted his teeth and tugged with everything he had. "Almost there," he panted, inching backward toward the shore. Elliott's body scraped against the rocks as the boy dragged him closer. When Theo finally collapsed onto the bank, Elliott lay beside him, gasping for air. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but he was alive. Theo's chest heaved as he looked at the man, unsure of what to do next. The distant sound of sirens cut through the quiet, growing louder with every second. Relief washed over Theo as he realized someone must have heard his earlier shouts. Help was coming. But Theo wasn't done yet. He knelt beside Elliott, shaking his shoulder. "Stay awake," he pleaded. "They're almost here." Elliott's eyes fluttered open, his breathing ragged. His lips were blue from the cold, and his voice barely rose above a whisper. "Who are you?" Theo leaned closer, his own breaths coming in sharp gasps. "My name is Theo," he said quickly, his teeth chattering. "I saw what happened. You're gonna be okay. Help is coming." The sirens grew louder now, echoing through the trees. But Elliott's body was trembling violently, and Theo didn't know if he could hold on until the paramedics arrived. He grabbed Elliott's hand, trying to keep him conscious. "Don't go to sleep, okay? Stay awake, you hear me?" Elliott blinked slowly, his head rolling to the side. Theo's stomach knotted with fear. What if he didn't make it? What if the ambulance didn't come in time? The boy jumped to his feet, his socks soaked and caked with mud. He ran to the edge of the road, waving his arms frantically as a police car screeched to a stop. "Over here!" Theo yelled, his voice cracking. Two officers got out, followed closely by paramedics carrying a stretcher. Theo led them to the riverbank, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. "He fell. Oh no, he was pushed into the river. I pulled him out, but he's really cold, and I think he hit his head or something." The paramedics quickly went to work. wrapping Elliott in a thermal blanket and checking his vitals. One of the officers turned to Theo, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "You pulled him out of the river by yourself?" Theo nodded, still trying to catch his breath. "I didn't know what else to do." The officer crouched down, looking Theo in the eye. "That was incredibly brave, son. You probably saved his life." The officer crouched down, looking Theo in the eye. "That was incredibly brave, son. You probably saved his life." Theo glanced at Elliott, who was being loaded onto the stretcher. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of pride. But the weight of what he'd seen, what he knew, was still heavy on his mind. As the paramedics carried Elliott toward the ambulance, Theo tugged on the officer's sleeve. "The woman, the one who was with him," he said, his voice shaking. "She pushed him. I saw it." The officer's expression hardened. "Are you sure?" Theo nodded, his heart pounding. "I saw her do it. She walked away after." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before pulling out a notepad. "Can you describe her? Anything you remember will help." Theo hesitated, his mind racing back to the moment on the bridge. He described her auburn hair, her coat, the way she looked so calm as she walked away. The officer jotted it all down, his jaw tightening with every detail. But as the ambulance doors closed and the flashing lights disappeared down the road, Theo couldn't help but wonder if the woman would get away before they found her.